Hi, and welcome back to my channel. In this video you have part 3 of my SCASL project. This is the last part with all middle grade books. I have 8 middle grade books to talk about in this video. In the next video I will have about half and half, finishing up the middle grade, getting into the young adult books. So we'll start off with 2 books that I do not have physically. One of these I never had physically, the other I did have from the library but returned it and there was a long wait. Didn't get it in time. With several of the others, because May ended and I accidentally returned them to the library before filming this, it would have been a really long wait to get a hold of the physical copy. However, several of them I have gone ahead and purchased and will be putting them in my classroom library. These 2, however, that I do not have physical copies of, I will not be putting in my classroom library. Alright, so the first book that I'm going to talk about is Those Kids from Fawn Creek. This was my lowest rated out of all of the books that I've read for this middle grade portion of the project. It's not a bad book. Rated at 3.5 stars. However, I've forgotten so much about it, about the details, that I filmed a whole clip trying to explain the plot of this book and ending up accidentally confusing it with What Happened to Rachel Riley, which is a book that I'm going to talk about in part 4. So that's not necessarily good. Fawn Creek is a very small town, and I think it's rural North Carolina, somewhere in the south, I believe. And there's a rivalry with another town over, and you've got a bunch of perspectives. And honestly, I don't even remember enough to tell you details about this. I just was not impressed by this. If I remember correctly, there's another character who lives in that other town who used to be part of Fawn Creek and is one of those it girls that holds a lot of sway on a lot of the characters that she left behind, but is not really a nice character. It just, I just didn't gel with this book. It's got a fairly high rating, higher than what I thought. I don't think, however, that there's going to be a lot of appeal for the students necessarily that will be in my classroom. It's a middling book. As you can tell by my lack of details on the review, not one that I rated all that highly. Then we come to the next book that I have, and that is another 3.5 star reads, but I enjoyed it a little bit more than the first one, and that is Yonder by Allie Standish. Appeal though, I think this one is definitely the lowest out of all of the ones that I've looked at on this whole list. It's historical fiction that sounds like it's a little bit fantastical, but you're not quite sure. And there's just not enough to draw a student in. Sorry, again, it's summertime. The dehumidifier is going to be going on. But in Yonder, you have a male main character, which there's not a lot of in a lot of these younger books. So I wish that I had enjoyed this one better. But he is middle school age. I don't remember whether it's younger or older, and he has a friend that who is older, who ends up going missing and had a terrible home life, and it also happens to be the home front during World War II. So I think it's 1943 that the book is set, somewhere after the US had gotten involved in the war, maybe 1942. I just never ended up being compelled by the story being told. There were a few moments that were really heartbreaking and engaging and made me empathize with the characters, hence the 3.5 star read, and thus enjoying it a little bit more than Those Kids from Fawn Creek. But overall, nothing really stood out to me about this book. And appeal-wise, I think it's going to be a lot lower. The next 2 books that I have to talk about, I rated 4 stars. I have a physical copy of one, and I will probably be purchasing a physical copy of the other, but I have a library book at the moment. The first one of those is Ellen Outside the Lines. And I thought this one was really intriguing. So Ellen is on the autism spectrum, fully identifies with it, and is stepping out of her comfort zone to go on a school trip to Barcelona. And her father is going on the trip, and she has a really good friend as well who's going on this trip, and she wants her structure, she wants her routine, but there are different things that happen along the way that sort of put a spanner in the works. And I thought that A.J. Sass did a really good job in humanizing and just presenting Ellen's life and how she encounters all of the, like her whole life basically, and the lens by which she sees everything and how that's different than a neurotypical person, and yet not less than a neurotypical person. There were a few things in there that I didn't necessarily jive with. It wasn't necessarily my absolute favorite. However, there wasn't anything negative about the book. I enjoyed Ellen's discovery of how she can learn and grow and have other techniques to help her move forward and exist in the world and develop new friendships, even though that's difficult for her. This is excellent representation. Next, we have another book that has really good representation, and that is Hummingbird by Natalie Lloyd. This is mainly a contemporary story, but it has a little bit of magical realism in it. In this story, the main character, whose name I've forgotten, she has brittle bone syndrome, I think is what it's called. I don't remember the actual medical term for it, but what that means is she spends a lot of time in a wheelchair because if she trips and falls or bumps into something, a bone will break. She has to spend recovery time for that bone to heal and then rebuild the muscles in her leg. But she lives in a very rural town, small town, Tennessee, and she dearly wants to go to middle school. She wants to go to an actual school. For most of her life, her mom and stepdad, and her dad is also in the picture, they've schooled her at home just to eliminate a lot of the risks that she would face in a normal school hallway. But her big dream is to go to an actual middle school. She's also obsessed with country music. She has 2 different wheelchairs. One she names Dolly, one she names Reba, Dolly Parton, Reba McEntire. She's a fascinating character, so full of personality. And the magical realism element in here has to do with, I believe, a hummingbird, a certain type of bird, and there's feathers. And I couldn't tell at first whether or not those were real feathers or they were describing snow or some sort of other natural phenomenon, but it really is magical realism. But the way that Natalie Lloyd leans into it and incorporates it into the story makes it a lot more believable and understandable, and makes the main character a highly empathetic character to learn alongside with and empathize with. I thought this was really, really strong. Appeal wise, I'm not sure where it would rank. I mean, it's clear from the cover that this is a character who suffers from some sort of physical disability, and that's definitely mentioned in the synopsis. I know that I said I would rank them based on appeal or try to figure out what the appeal would be. I'm not middle school age. Obviously, I'm not 100% sure what they may or may not be interested in. That's one of the difficulties for me in doing this project, is trying to figure out what is that appeal. I think that there is a group of kids who would be interested in this story, and I think it would be an excellent book to use and to recommend. Then we have my 4.5 star reads, and I have 2 of those. So that means that I have 2 5-star reads to recommend. At least I think one of them is a 5-star. It might be a very high 4.5 star, but I know that the last one is a 5-star. So first off, we have Sweet and Sour by Debbie Michiko Florence. In this book, you have 2 characters. Their families are best friends. They're Japanese American. This is very early middle grade. They are just going into, this is the summer before 6th grade, I should say. Since I'm going to be teaching 8th grade, this is probably not necessarily one that I would recommend highly for my students. They might think it's more babyish, but I would definitely have it available. It might be something interesting for them to look back on, to look at the immigrant experience. The 2 main characters, at least from her point of view, and she's the main character in here, have had a falling out. He did something the previous summer, or no, 2 summers ago, that basically broke her heart. So let me back up a little bit. The setup for this is that these two families spend every summer together at the summer home of his family, I believe. And they've been best friends all growing up. And she starts to believe that she sort of has a crush on him as well, or at least towards the end of this book. But he does something that betrays her friendship, but he doesn't know that he did it. And then the reason that they didn't spend the previous summer together was because I think his mom or his dad got a transfer to spend a year in Japan. And so they weren't available to do this summer trip. And so the main character has kind of been holding on to a grudge for all that time. And this book, nice and short, good appeal there. It really delves into the ideas of friendships because she's dealing with the betrayal of a longtime friend. She's dealing with having to be separated from a new friend who lives back home, who she spent the previous summer with but won't be spending this summer with, and also trying to make a new friend who he and his family know, and some of that connection there. And I thought it was sweet and adorable, and just, it was a hit for me. Not quite an all-time favorite, but a 4.5-star read, really strong. Then we have Dream, Annie Dream, and in this one, Annie is a first-generation American. Her parents both emigrated from Japan. This is set in the 90s. It's really interesting to talk to students today because they would never associate Japanese people and culture as being the less than the made in China idea that we have today. But that's what a lot of Japanese technology was, and a lot of the people were looked at negatively. A lot of stereotypes were still existing further on from World War II, and this was really fascinating to get a look at. And it's first-person perspective because the author, Waka T. Brown, this was not exactly her experience, but it draws a lot from her memory and her lived experience, and you could definitely see that put in here. And Annie has a best friend who is very white. She deals with some things that start to develop with that friend, and she also loves both basketball and drama. There are several different plays that go on throughout this story where she wants to participate, and there's a lot of microaggressions talked about. There's a lot of, she's having to deal with the fact that her mom really wants her to be a doctor, but she doesn't really care about that. She wants to go into the arts. She wants to play basketball. She's dealing with that family pressure along with the microaggressions, and this was a really interesting exploration of this time that, yes, technically this is historical fiction, yet I was alive during many of these years. Maybe not the same age as Annie, but it's really fascinating to look at this time period. Second to last, we have A Song Called Home. I really enjoyed this book. This is the book that I thought is either a really high 4.5 stars or a 5 stars. And in this book, I don't know the ethnicities of any of the characters. I don't remember them, if they were established at the beginning or not. So I don't know about that representation. In this book, you have a main character who is early middle school years, and her mom at the beginning of the book has just gotten remarried to this really cool guy. He seems really nice. He really cares about the family. She also has an older sister. She also has trauma based on the alcoholism of her dad. He's sometimes in their life, but when he's in their life, sometimes he's in the throes of his alcoholism, and some of the interactions are not all that positive or healthy, and she has to deal with this because she still loves her dad, but she hates seeing what his alcoholism did to him and did to their family. So she doesn't necessarily like want to live with him or put him on a pedestal. She sees what he did is wrong, but she still clearly loves him. At the beginning of the book, I forget the exact incident, but they get home and there's a guitar on the front porch, and she thinks it's from her dad. And so she decides, I am going to learn how to play the guitar because I want to be able to play it for my dad and have him be really proud of me, and just that whole longing to be loved by her dad. And she also has to deal with changing schools because when her mom got remarried, they went and moved out to her new stepdad's house, which is not technically in the same zone as the previous school, same district. And they go for a while because they don't want to have them change schools. But then they found out about the address change and they have to immediately change schools. And so on top of everything else, all the other changes that have happened, she has to deal with that. And I just think this is absolutely well told and heart-wrenching. So I definitely highly recommend this one. Then we come to my 5-star read, and the book that I think is either tied or just surpasses my number 1 altogether on this list, and that is The Bluest Sky by Christina Gonzalez. When I saw this on the list, I did not expect that. This book is set around the time of the Mariel boat lift. And when I used to teach middle grade social studies, this was one of the things that we talked about. I forget at which point in the curriculum. I knew a little bit about the Mariel boat lift. Thinking back to when I taught that to my students, and after reading this book, I'm like, oh man, I shortchanged this story so much and simplified it too much. In basic terms, this is set in Cuba, and you're dealing with the Castro regime. And at one point there was like protests and riots against the Castro regime, and Castro was like, okay, fine. You don't want to be part of my country anymore. You don't want to be Cuban. You can leave. If you find a boat, you can leave. That's incredibly, incredibly simplified. And this book, through the eyes of this main character, shines such a light on all of the different factors that were at work and the uncomfortable nature of trying to live and exist in that sort of a situation. There's so much more going on. The main character in this story has an older brother who is, I believe, 15. His father, many years before, I think when the kid was around like 4 or so he doesn't really know his father, but his father was arrested and then like exiled from Cuba and now lives in the United States. So his mother is having to take care of them. His mother's mom, his grandmother, is actually a high-ranking official in the Cuban communist government and fully believes in all of that as well. Now the mother wants to reunite with her husband. She does not want her son having to go into the military because that was required. They were conscripted, and at this time I didn't realize it, but they were sending some of their soldiers overseas, and I forget the country, but somewhere over in Africa, supporting a revolution, a rebellion of another communist group. And the mom doesn't want her older son to have to face that. And so she's trying to leave it, and she uses this invitation that Castro extends to try to leave. There are so many nuances in here, and when it got towards the end of the book, so an event happens where I was listening to it on the ride down to Florida when my family went to Disney a couple weeks ago, and I almost started crying. It made me tear up. It was so impactful. This just shines a light on an area of history that not many people know about. Hands down, this is my favorite of all of the books that I've read thus far this year for this series. So there you go. There are the 8 books that I have read for part 3. Coming up in part 4, I will finish the middle grade list, maybe talk about my rankings at that time. I will not have all of the books because some of them I have returned to the library, and then get into the young adult books. Thanks so much for watching. I hope to see you in the next one.